editorial regulation in terms of what's allowed on air and what isn't. And when you look at what Tucker Carlson and some of these other folks on Fox do, it is very, very clearly incitement of violence. Very clearly incitement of violence. And that is the line that I think we have to be willing to contend with.
That was New York progressive Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being interviewed by MSNBC host and former White House press secretary Jen Psaki. Now that news is out that Tucker Carlson and Fox are actually parting ways, Daily Caller chief national correspondent Henry Rogers noted on Twitter, Fox's stock has plummeted, bad for business indeed. So we were planning to talk about this AOC soundbite before we got the news about Tucker, and we have another segment you can check out for us giving our reacting in real time to the news that he's out at Fox. We were going to talk about this anyway. You know, this is very, and I find Jen Psaki just kind of nodding along to what AOC is saying here to be particularly disturbing, because she did just work in the government as a spokesperson, and she should know, and really AOC ought to know as well as a current government staffer, that you can't just call people saying things you don't like incitement and suggest that it's illegal or should not be.
It's quite clearly
very
not
bad. It's
incitement of violence,
yes.
Given the fact that no one was able to make anything stick. I'm not trying to be funny, but there are plenty of people who absolutely had an appetite to prosecute Donald Trump for incitement of violence. There was an impeachment proceeding. They weren't able to get any of that to stick. Now, that's not to say that I think Donald Trump incited the crowds at 1-6. He certainly, in a non-legal sense, I don't think there's any argument that for Donald Trump acting in the way he did, what happened on that day probably would not have happened.
But she was arguing legally. She was clearly saying it makes the legal definition of incitement to violence, which, if you know anything about the laws, you and I do, for it to be incitement to violence, it has to have time, place, and manner. You have to call for a violent or a criminal act against a specific person or thing at a specific time so that there is likelihood of, and people have to be able to hear you. It has to be like it's going to actually happen imminently.
Yeah, and Donald Trump towed the line and didn't do those things.
Right, kind of vague, we should do something, not great, maybe, and people do it. That's not incitement to violence.
Right, and I don't understand why one can't just make the moral argument, make the argument that it was a behavior unbecoming our president of the United States, say that it was dangerous, say that it was a provocation, say whatever you want to say about it.
Just say it was wrong.
Getting over your skis.
Say it was wrong. Say this was all based on, if we're talking about the January 6th stuff, this was based on a incorrect idea about the election. It was wrong. And you could just make that case without saying, and the people who disagree with me should be, punished legally.
But speaking of being punished legally, of course, Fox News did settle this Dominion lawsuit for nearly $800 million, presumably because they thought there was significant risk of being punished legally as a consequence of this defamation lawsuit with the Dominion voting systems. And now we have the news not only that Tucker Carlson is out, but that there has been a notable dip in Fox News's stock price as a consequence. Now, it's it was a couple of dollars, I think, there. It looks zoomed in like that to be perhaps more significant than it actually is. And these things do tend to happen and bounce back. That doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be long-term consequences for Fox. But I wonder what you make of Fox's future absent Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, we're still continuing to process this. I think I said it a bunch of times in the last segment. This is just huge news. Yeah. He did not get a final show. His final show was Friday. Again, I'm speculating. It doesn't seem to me like he knew that this was going to be the end last week. So I suggest, I would suspect that something was spraying on him now it was maybe not you're being fired. It might have been we want you to make a statement, or there's going to be new rules for your show, or there's going to be something that he just wasn't willing to do and he walked. Because I wouldn't necessarily think they would get rid of him following this Dominion lawsuit being handled with a payment rather than a guilty judgment or some kind I don't know if it's possible that a secret requirement of the deal they reached with Dominion was getting rid of Tucker. I don't know if that's even possible, or if there's no way that seems like something it would leak out, but.
Yeah, no, look, the timing of this and the posture of this suggests that it was not Tucker's choice. Would you agree with that? That if Tucker knew and was choosing to leave on his own volition, that he would have had a final show, he would have said something about it.
I mean, it might have been
He would
his
have
choice,
announced future
but they
projects.
wanted something moving forward. They wanted to make changes to the show that he was unwilling to do, so he walked away.
Which I would argue makes it not his choice, that he was basically pushed out of the show. That being said, you know, I think the real question is, what does Tucker do next? How much animosity is there with Fox News? And how is he going to frame his departure? I think there's a real interesting case to be made by Tucker Carlson that Fox News was in the Donald Trump business, that as we heard from the Dominion disclosures, he had his own skepticism of Donald Trump. He said that he hated Donald Trump, that he was looking forward to a day where he could ignore Donald Trump. And he could frame some of his, let's say, excesses at Fox or some of his lesser takes at Fox as being part of that machine from which he's now free. He could really double down on the idea of him being an independent news creator, someone who's no longer beholden to the corporate machine, who's able to call more balls and strikes, and to give less biased opinions on the Republican primary race, which stands to be really interesting. He has partnered with certain people on the left, like Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore, offering them opportunities to come on his show and talk about left issues, like anti-war issues, like Julian Assange. And if we saw more of that, and more of a genuine embrace of a kind of populism that isn't quite so committed to the future, the positive future of the Republican Party, I think he could carve out a really interesting space for himself, and one that could hurt Fox more as they are less able to capture that part of the audience.
He's clearly not going to be able to work with so-called left populists like AOC when she's calling for him to face criminal penalties for speaking his mind.
Right.
So that shows you the difficulty that there will be there.
AOC, you know, I got to tell you, for those of you who aren't really in the left media space, is very much on the outs with the core of the left as well. She recently did a very rare interview with a left media outlet, David Sirota, over at The Lever, and he took questions from this audience and put them to AOC. So there were some substantive questions there about why, for instance, she voted to crush the rail strike, a vote that leftist union people have pointed out is completely antithetical to what it means to be a pro-worker leftist, like AOC presents herself as being. And her answer wasn't great. And people criticized her roundly for it. I had Shama Sawant, Social City Councilwoman from Seattle, on my show today, just really tearing apart AOC's record on that and the way she's behaved for most of her time in Congress. So I do think there is a realignment that's happening on the left as well as on the right about what it really means to be a populist, what it means to be captured by the Democratic Party. And to the extent that AOC or others might have been captured by the Democrats, I think that Tucker Carlson has an argument that his increasing independence from Fox News as kind of a branch of Republican media, the Republican media sphere, can make him a more powerful interlocutor and grow a much larger audience, and one that includes increasing numbers of people from the left, like it or not.
Well, we'll have more Rising right after this.